Hi, I'm Rachel. I was diagnosed with nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin lymphoma several years ago. It's one of the slow-growing forms of lymphoma. So for me, lymphoma has had quite a big impact on my work and my ability to work after university. So after I finished my Masters, I was actually unable to work for 2 years because of the fatigue. And after that, I was sort of trying to slowly get back into work and build up to getting back into full-time work. So I'm currently on watch and wait for my type of lymphoma, so I was wondering what I'd need to tell my employer about that.
Well, I think you should tell your employer about that. Watch and wait is very specific to lymphoma, so I think you'd need to explain exactly what that is. Yeah. But given you're covered by the Equality Act and you're protected in terms of having time off, it would be a reasonable adjustment to have time off for any appointments that are needed. That it's important to let your employer know and give them as much notice as possible for any appointments or checkups that you need to have. Not to tell them won't be doing you any favours, so important to let them know.
So I'm thinking about changing jobs in the future, but I was wondering about what I should say to a future employer changing jobs, or when I'd need to tell them. So I don't want it to affect my application at all or affect their decision to employ me because I'm on watch and wait. So sort of when would I need to tell them?
I mean, difficult because in a sense, you're not required to disclose your cancer to an employer. And if you were to join an employer and told them once you started that you're on watch and wait, again, it's not illegal. You're not required to have told your employer. So I think the best time to tell your employer if you were moving into a new job would be if you haven't said anything at interview or whatever, for good reason. I would say it's at the stage where you've taken up the offer. So potentially you've accepted the offer, so that can't be withdrawn. You may not actually have started work. I'd potentially kind of fix to go and talk to my boss or HR or whoever's appropriate, let them know I'm on watch and wait, and just tell them that, at some point I will be having medical appointments and I'll just need some time off to attend them.
So I've got quite a big gap on my CV now from not being able to work. So I'm just wondering how I should go about mentioning that or explaining it on the CV.
I think it's quite difficult actually knowing what is the right thing to do. I've always said to people the last thing you should ever do is lie or be dishonest. So some people try to cover up a gap by saying they've had a long holiday or been doing something that they haven't been doing, and that really is not helpful. Personally, I wouldn't worry. I think if there's an obvious gap, you can put something in a covering letter, or covering email, but there's no guarantee the employer won't, for whatever reason, put your application on the pile to be considered at another time. My preference would be not necessarily to say anything and to send in the application, but to be prepared to talk about the gap at interview, which means thinking about how you're going to answer the question. I see you took X years to complete your degree. Would you like to tell me why that was the case? And in those cases, I'd write down your answer. I'd repeat your answer to yourself a few times until you're comfortable with it. I have to say that in many cases, sometimes employers don't see the gap. And in those cases, though, I would actually bring it to their attention in a confident way. So if they're talking about your degree, you would say, well, I'm assuming you will have noticed it took X years to complete my degree, which was longer than it would normally take. And the reason for that was at that period I was being treated for X and I'm now recovered, etc., etc. So I think that's the time to talk about it with confidence and a way that can allay any doubts that they have or even that you may have before the interview.
Fatigue has been sort of a really big part of returning to work and sort of trying to manage the fatigue returning to work. I mean, one of the things that I try to do is pacing. So sort of make sure that if I've got a busy day at work, or sometimes my job involves travelling to events, I make sure I've got a quiet evening the night before. I mean, for me, I guess at my age, I'm sort of just starting out in my career, I'm quite happy for kind of all my energy to be put into work and maybe not doing huge amounts outside of work. So I don't know what sort of advice you give to anyone if they're trying to cope with fatigue while getting back to work.
I think it's about balance. I think for a lot of people who are working, they need to do what they can at work, having agreed with their manager what's possible. I think for busy family members, say particularly mums, very often they'll go home after doing a few hours at work, they'll be on a phased return, and suddenly they're confronted with having to get dinner ready or sort out the kids, and I think it's an important time to delegate. So it's the time when the whole family needs to pull together so that mum doesn't, or dad, or whoever it is, get burdened with the things that they would normally have done before they were ill. Sometimes that's a problem because families like to feel we're all back to normal, and we all try and rush back to normal rather too quickly. So I think it's about getting a proper balance. But at work, I think it's important that you take it gradually, and you have a proper phased return for as long as is necessary. Many companies only have a policy that is, you're due to be back at work full time within 6 or 8 or 12 weeks. We are entitled to a phased return and reasonable adjustments pretty much for as long as it takes. And so it's important to kind of recognise that and as you say, to pace yourself. I know certainly in my case I didn't do that, and I made all the mistakes of trying to work what were normal hours, and would then go home and collapse exhausted, and wasn't prepared to tell my employer I wasn't coping. All of those things didn't do me any good whatsoever. So it's good to hear that you are pacing yourself. You're definitely doing all the right things.
And do you have any tips on how to cope with the emotional aspect of not being able to get back to sort of an old normal and having to find a bit more of a new normal at work?
I think it's all about moving forward and kind of managing your own expectations. It's a bit of a cliche this, but there are over 200 different forms of cancer and many, many different forms of treatment for each type of cancer. And if you add your own individual physiology and psychology on top of that, we each have our own unique individual experience of recovering from cancer. And many of us have totally false expectations and beat ourselves up unnecessarily when we're not doing as well as we think we should, when all of our knowledge is based on no knowledge whatsoever. So I think it's kind of cutting yourself some slack, maybe getting some coaching or counselling to help you through it. But it takes time, I'm afraid to say, and the emotional impact of cancer is as normal a reaction to what you've been through as the physical impact of cancer. So it's just a question of kind of coming to terms with that and being kind to yourself when you're having a bad day.
Yeah.